Mud, rust, and the biting cold of Kepler's rust don't care who you are. When Dean dragged the dying pilot from her burning ship, he saw nothing but another piece of scrap to fix. He had no idea the woman shivering in his shop was the galaxy's hunted Empress. The sky over Kepler's rust was the color of a bruised knee, a perpetual, sickly purple that leaked oily rain 9 days out of 10. Dean hated the rain. It got into the manifold joints of the atmospheric scrubbers he repaired. It rusted the coupling pins. Mostly, it just made everything cold. He was under the chassis of a heavy-duty mining crawler, a plasma torch in one hand and a mug of lukewarm chicory substitute in the other, when the sky tore open. It wasn't the low, rumbling groan of a corporate freighter entering atmosphere. This was a sharp, violent crack that made Dean's teeth rattle in his skull. The shockwave hit a second later, blowing out the corrugated plastic windows of his workshop and knocking him hard against the crawler's treads. His coffee spilled, mingling with the grease and mud on the floor. Dean swore, rubbing the back of his neck. He crawled out from under the rig and looked through the shattered window. A trail of thick, acrid black smoke scarred the purple sky. At the end of it, about 2 miles out in the bogs, a fire burned unnaturally bright. White hot. Magnesium hot. Nobody survived a crash like that. Not on Kepler's rust. The bog would swallow the ship, and the local fauna, mostly scavengers with too many legs and acid-laced mandibles, would take care of the rest. The smart thing to do, the cynical, surviving on a rim world thing to do, was to patch the window, turn up the heater, and mind his own business. Dean grabbed his heavy canvas coat and his utility belt. He took the hover skiff. The engine whined in protest against the thick, driving rain, the repulsor lifts struggling to find purchase over the uneven, sucking mud of the bog. It took him 20 minutes to navigate the treacherous terrain, following the column of smoke that refused to dissipate in the downpour. When he finally crested a ridge of hardened slag, he killed the engine. The ship didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere Dean had ever seen. It had no bulky cargo holds, no exposed piping, no corporate logos plastered over cheap alloy. It was sleek, aerodynamic, and completely black, or at least it had been, before the atmosphere and the crash had chewed away half its hull. It looked like a dagger driven into the mud. And it was humming. A low, dangerous vibration that Dean could feel in his boots. He slid down the embankment, pulling a heavy titanium pry bar from his belt. The heat coming off the hull was blistering, turning the rain into a thick wall of steam. "Hey!" Dean yelled, his voice sounding thin and pathetic against the crackle of the fire and the hiss of steam. "Anyone in there?" Nothing. He approached the cockpit. The glass, if it was glass, was opaque, shattered in a spiderweb pattern but refusing to give way. Dean wedged the flat end of the pry bar into the seam of the canopy. He planted his boots in the mud, ignored the heat radiating through his thick gloves, and threw his entire weight backward. The metal groaned. Sparks showered over his shoulder, biting into his wet coat. Dean gritted his teeth, his muscles burning, joints popping in protest. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was a 34-year-old mechanic with a bad back and a worse attitude. But he pulled anyway. With a sickening screech, the canopy gave way, flipping backward and burying itself in the mud. Thick chemical smoke poured out. Dean coughed, waving it away, and leaned in. She was slumped over the controls. She wore armor, but not the bulky, utilitarian plating the local enforcers wore. It was form-fitting, scaled, and matte black, though half of it was currently fused and slagged from the heat. A heavy piece of shrapnel from the console had embedded itself in her side, right below the ribs. Blood, dark and thick, was pooling in the seat. Dean checked her pulse at the neck. Weak, but there. Thready. Fast. All right, he muttered to himself, the rain slicking his hair to his forehead. This is a terrible idea. He reached in, wrapping his arms under her armpits. She groaned, a sharp, ragged sound, but didn't wake. Getting her out was a nightmare of physics and slippery surfaces. She was dead weight, her armor adding at least 40 pounds. Dean slipped twice, scraping his chin on the hull, but he didn't let go. He dragged her through the mud, away from the humming engine that sounded increasingly like a bomb ready to go off. He hauled her onto the flatbed of his skiff, throwing a tarp over her to keep the worst of the toxic rain off her wounds. He didn't look back at the ship as he gunned the engine. 5 minutes later, the bog lit up behind them, a silent flash of blue light followed by a shock wave that nearly knocked the skiff out of the air. By the time they reached the workshop, Dean was exhausted, shivering, and covered in someone else's blood. He carried her inside, kicking the heavy steel door shut with his heel, and laid her out on his sturdy wooden workbench, sweeping aside half-repaired drone parts and oily rags. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the shop, she looked worse. Her skin was pale, ashen. Her hair, a dark, matted mess, clung to her cheeks. Dean fetched his medical kit. It was a standard-issue industrial trauma box. Plasteel clamps, synthetic sutures, a few tubes of generic med gel, and a bottle of high-proof grain alcohol he usually kept for weekends. "Sorry about this," he said to the unconscious woman. He used heavy shears to cut away the ruined flight suit and the undermesh of her armor. The shrapnel was jagged. Dean poured the alcohol over his tools, took a deep breath, and gripped the metal protruding from her side with a pair of heavy pliers. He didn't hesitate. He pulled it out in one smooth, brutal motion. She screamed, her eyes flying open, blindly thrashing. Dean clamped a hand down on her shoulder, pinning her to the bench with his weight. "Hold still, you'll bleed out." She fought him for a second, her muscles corded and tense, before the pain pulled her back under, and she went limp again. Dean exhaled a shaky breath. He packed the wound with gauze, flooded it with medgel, and used the synthetic sutures to staple the flesh back together. It was ugly, functional work. Plumber's work. When he was done, he wrapped her torso tightly in bandages, wiped the mud and grease from her face with a damp cloth, and carried her to his cot in the corner of the shop. He covered her with a heavy wool blanket. Then, Dean walked over to his sink, washed the blood off his hands with harsh industrial soap, and sat down in his chair to watch the door. It took 14 hours for her to wake up. Dean spent the time fixing the atmospheric scrubber he'd neglected yesterday, keeping one ear tuned to the steady, shallow breathing coming from the cot. He had also taken the time to strip the remaining armor plates off her and hide them under a loose floorboard. Whatever material that armor was made of, it had shrugged off his plasma cutter like it was a minor annoyance. He had to use a diamond-tipped sonic saw just to get through the buckles. That kind of tech meant money. Serious money. And serious money meant serious trouble. He was sitting at his workbench, eating a bowl of rehydrated protein noodles, when the breathing pattern changed. It stopped being the slow rhythm of the unconscious and became the controlled, shallow breathing of someone pretending to be asleep. Dean didn't look up from his noodles. He took a bite, chewed loudly, and swallowed. "There's a mug of water on the crate next to you," he said, his voice flat. "Don't try to sit up too fast. I had to staple your oblique muscles back together." Silence. Then, the rustle of the wool blanket. Dean finally turned his head. She was sitting up, her face white with pain, one hand pressed tightly against her bandaged side. Her other hand was sweeping the immediate area, frantically searching for a weapon that wasn't there. She wore a pair of Dean's oversized grey sweatpants and a faded thermal shirt. She looked like a drowned rat, but her eyes, a striking, cold grey, were sharp as broken glass. They locked on to Dean, calculating, measuring. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, raw from the smoke, but it carried an undeniable edge of authority. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "Kepler's Rust," Dean said, gesturing with his chopsticks. "Sector 4 scrap colony. You crashed in the bog." She processed this, her eyes darting around the messy workshop. She took in the rusted tools, the leaky roof, the flickering lights, and finally, the unremarkable, stubble-covered man eating noodles in front of her. "You pulled me out." "I did," Dean said. "Ship went up a few minutes later. Nothing left to salvage. You're lucky I was bored." She swung her legs over the edge of the cot, wincing sharply. "My gear." "Ruined," Dean lied smoothly. "Slagged to the suit. Had to cut most of it away just to get to the hole in your side." She stared at him, those cold eyes trying to pry the truth out of his skull. Dean stared back, thoroughly unimpressed. He'd negotiated with union bosses, cartel smugglers, and corrupt local magistrates. A glaring woman in his sweatpants didn't intimidate him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Dean. Just Dean. I fix things. Tractors, scrubbers, occasionally people who fall out of the sky." "Who are you?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but Dean saw it. The mental calculus of what to reveal and what to hide. "Sloane," she said. "Well, Sloane, you owe me a new pry bar and a bottle of alcohol." Sloane ignored the remark. She pushed herself to her feet. She swayed, her face draining of the little color it had, and grabbed the wall for support. Dean sighed, setting his bowl down. "I told you not to stand up. You're going to tear the staples." "I need to leave," Sloane gritted out, forcing herself to take a step toward the heavy steel door. "I need a comms relay, high band, encrypted." Dean laughed, a short, cynical bark. "Right. Let me just check my backyard for a military-grade communication array. You're on a rim-world dump, lady. The best we've got is a localized radio tower that bounces signals off a rusted satellite, and it only works when the ion storms aren't acting up, which they are." Sloane stopped, leaning heavily against a steel support pillar. She looked down at her bare feet on the cold concrete floor. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, Dean saw the sheer, crushing weight of the universe settle on her shoulders. The absolute isolation. "They're coming," she whispered, almost to herself. "Who?" Sloane looked up at him. "People you do not want to meet, Dean. If they find me here, this whole settlement will burn. They will leave nothing alive. Not you. Not anyone. Standard pirate procedure," Dean muttered, walking over to his toolbox and pulling out a heavy wrench. He wasn't threatened, just annoyed. "They usually show up once a year for a shakedown. We pay our tithe in scrap and refined fuel." "They are not pirates," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious tenor. "They are the Praetorian Guard." Dean paused, the wrench halfway to his tool belt. The Praetorian Guard. The elite death squads of the Imperial throne, rumored to only answer to the Empress herself. They didn't shake down rim worlds. They leveled continents. "Why would the Guard be looking for a pilot out here?" Dean asked, narrowing his eyes. "Because I have something they want," she lied again. It was a good lie, delivered with conviction. But Dean saw the slight tension in her jaw. Before Dean could press the issue, the heavy steel door of his workshop vibrated. Not from a knock. It was a low, structural tremor. Outside, the constant drumming of the rain was suddenly drowned out by a deafening, mechanical roar. It was a sound Dean knew well, but had never heard this close to his shop. the localized atmospheric displacement of a military-grade dropship settling down. The roar shook the dust from the rafters, making the overhead lights violently swing on their chains. Dean looked at Sloane. Her grey eyes were wide, fixed on the steel door. "They're early," she breathed. Dean looked from her to the door, and down at the heavy wrench in his hand. He sighed, a long, tired sound of a man who knew he was about to do something incredibly stupid. "Get in the crawl space under the floorboards," Dean said, walking toward the door. Now, the pounding on the door didn't sound like knuckles. It sounded like the butt of a heavy assault rifle striking the reinforced steel. 3 sharp, measured hits. Dean pointed a grease-stained finger at the floorboards. Sloane didn't argue. She slid off the cot, biting back a gasp as her stapled side stretched, and slipped into the maintenance crawl space beneath the grated floor. Dean kicked an oil-stained rug over the loose board, grabbed a rag, and walked to the door, wiping non-existent grease from his hands. He keyed the release pad. The heavy steel door slid back with a pneumatic hiss. The rain immediately blew sideways into the shop, bringing the smell of ozone and burnt fuel. 3 figures stood on the metal grating of his porch. They were encased in matte grey tactical armor that absorbed the flickering porch light rather than reflecting it. No unit insignias, no rank bars, just heavy, brutal efficiency. The one in the center took a step forward. Water sheeted off his visor. When he spoke, his voice was electronically filtered, flat and devoid of humanity. "Step aside, civilian." "Shop's closed," Dean said. He didn't move. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Unless you've got a busted atmospheric scrubber, I'm off the clock." The commander didn't find him funny. He stepped into Dean's personal space, the sheer bulk of his armor forcing Dean to take a half-step back. The 2 guards flanked him, heavy kinetic rifles tracking the interior of the workshop. "We are tracking a priority asset," the commander said. "A fugitive of the Imperial State. A crashed vessel was detected in Grid Delta 9. Footprints in the mud led to hover skiff tracks. The tracks led here." "I salvage," Dean replied evenly. "Saw the smoke, went to check it out. Ship was a total loss, cooked off before I could even get a wrench on it. Came back empty-handed." The commander stared at him through the opaque visor. "Search the premises." The 2 guards pushed past Dean. They didn't rummage. They moved with terrifying mechanical precision. They checked the rafters, the storage lockers, the hollow chassis of the mining crawler. One of them kicked over a stack of empty coolant crates. Dean watched them, his heart hammering a dull rhythm against his ribs. He kept his face bored, thoroughly unimpressed. "You guys always make this much of a mess?" Dean asked, tossing the dirty rag onto his workbench. "Because if you break my sonic calibrator, the local magistrate is going to hear about it." "Your local magistrate answers to the throne," the commander said, his helmet swiveling to scan the back wall. "And right now, the throne is burning." Dean frowned. "Not my problem. I just fixed tractors." The guard nearest the cot stopped. He looked down at the floor. He slowly reached out, his armored glove brushing against the heavy shears Dean had used earlier. The tip of the shears still had a smear of dark, wet blood on it. Dean's stomach dropped. He'd cleaned the tools, but not well enough. Sloppy. The guard turned, raising his rifle, the weapon whining as the magnetic coils charged. "Commander, fresh blood." The commander unholstered a heavy sidearm and pointed it directly at Dean's chest. "You have 5 seconds to produce the fugitive. 4. Dean calculated the distance to his workbench. Too far. He calculated the distance to the heavy wrench on his belt. Too slow. 3. "Look, pal, I just found her." 2. The floorboards beneath the guard erupted. Wood splintered and shattered as Sloane drove upward, launching herself out of the crawl space. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a 3-foot length of sharpened titanium piping she'd ripped from the subfloor plumbing. She drove it upward with everything she had left, bypassing the guard's heavy chest plate and driving it straight through the softer synthetic mesh under his armpit. The guard let out a choked, wet gargle and collapsed, his rifle clattering to the floor. The shop descended into absolute chaos. The commander pivoted, firing his sidearm. The round blew a hole through a steel support beam an inch from Sloane's head, showering her in sparks. She hit the floor, rolling agonizingly on her bad side, and grabbed the dead guard's kinetic rifle. Dean didn't wait. As the second guard swung his weapon toward Sloane, Dean grabbed his plasma torch from the belt, flicked the ignition, and slammed it into the joint behind the guard's knee. The torch flared white-hot, cutting through the armor plating like butter. The guard screamed, his leg buckling. As he dropped to one knee, Dean brought his heavy wrench down on the back of the man's helmet. The sickening crack of metal giving way echoed over the rain. 2 down. The commander realized the tactical disadvantage. He stepped backward toward the open door, seeking cover, his sidearm barking twice more. One round shattered the overhead fluorescent light, plunging the shop into a strobing, localized darkness. The other clipped Dean's shoulder, tearing through his canvas coat and spinning him hard into the workbench. Dean hit the ground, ears ringing. The smell of copper and burnt hair filled his nose. Through the strobing darkness, he saw Sloane push herself to one knee. She didn't flinch at the gunfire. She didn't hide. She braced the heavy kinetic rifle against her uninjured side, leveled it at the doorway, and fired a single, deafening shot. The commander's chest plate caught the round. The sheer kinetic force lifted him off his feet and threw him backward into the mud outside. He didn't get up. Silence rushed back into the shop, save for the steady drumming of the rain and the hiss of severed power lines. Dean stayed on the floor for a long moment. He touched his shoulder. His hand came away wet, but it was just a graze. The kinetic round had taken a chunk of meat, but missed the bone. He exhaled a long, shaky breath and looked over at Sloane. She was slumped against a steel crate, the heavy rifle resting across her lap. She was breathing hard, her face stark white, a fresh bloom of dark crimson seeping through her grey sweatpants where the staples had finally torn loose. "You killed my plumbing," Dean said, his voice raspy. Sloane let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Send the bill to the Capitol." Dean forced himself to his feet. He grabbed his medical kit again, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder, and knelt beside her. He ripped open a fresh packet of med gel. "We don't have time," she whispered, grabbing his wrist. Her grip was weak, trembling. "The dropship outside. It's fully automated. If I can get to the cockpit, I can override the nav computer." "You're bleeding out again," Dean said, pushing her hand away and slapping the gel over her torn stitches. "You won't make it to orbit if you bleed to death in the pilot's seat." She grabbed his collar, pulling him close. Her grey eyes were frantic now, the cold calculation replaced by raw, desperate urgency. "Listen to me. Kalen, my uncle, he orchestrated a coup. The orbital defenses, the inner fleet, they've all flipped. He sent the guard to hunt me down because I am the only legitimate heir to the sovereign command. If I die on this mudball, billions of people will burn in a civil war." Dean stared at her. He looked at her dirt-smudged face, the cheap thermal shirt she wore, the blood on her hands. "Sovereign command," Dean repeated slowly. "You're the Empress." "I am," she said, her voice steadying. "And I need to get off this planet." Dean looked back at the open door. The rain was washing the mud over the commander's body. Out in the bog, past the rusted scrap and the acidic pools, the sleek, heavily armed dropship idled, its engines humming a low, powerful note. He looked around his shop. It was ruined. Bullet holes in the equipment. 2 dead Praetorians bleeding out on his floor. A shattered window and a severed power line sparking in the corner. If anyone else from the guard showed up and found this, Dean was a dead man. Kepler's Rust was a dead colony. "All right," Dean said. He stood up, offering her a hand. "Let's go steal a spaceship." She took it. He hauled her to her feet, throwing her good arm over his uninjured shoulder. They walked out into the driving rain, stepping over the dead commander. The dropship's ramp was lowered. Dean helped her inside, the interior sterile and brightly lit, or smelling of synthetic leather and gun oil. He deposited her in the pilot's seat. She immediately began typing furiously on the console, blood smearing across the glass interface. The engines shifted pitch, a powerful whine that shook the mud off the landing gear. "Navlock is disengaged," Sloane breathed, her fingers flying over the controls. "Engaging stealth drives." Dean stood in the doorway of the cockpit. He crossed his arms. Sloane stopped typing and looked back at him. "Come with me." Dean laughed, a genuine cynical sound. "To do what? Fix your royal plumbing? I'm a grease monkey from Sector 4. I don't belong in a palace, and I sure as hell don't belong in a civil war." "You saved my life," Sloane said, her voice dropping the imperial edge. For the first time, she just sounded like a woman. A tired, grateful woman. "You fought the guard for a stranger. You're coming with me." "I fought the guard because they were messing up my shop," Dean corrected her gently. He pointed a thumb out toward the rain. "My life is out there. It's rusty and it's cold, but it's mine. You go win your war, Your Majesty. Just try not to blow up this side of the galaxy. I have a lot of back orders to fill." Sloane stared at him for a long moment. She saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the tired crinkles around his eyes. She nodded slowly. "I will not forget this. Dean of Kepler's Rust. Just don't forget to send a check for the pry bar," he said. He hit the bulkhead release and stepped back down the ramp into the mud. He didn't look back as the ramp sealed shut. A second later, the dropship lifted off the ground, entirely silent as the stealth drives kicked in. It shot upward, vanishing into the bruised purple sky, leaving behind nothing but a circle of flattened mud and the smell of ozone. Dean stood in the rain for a minute, letting the cold water wash the blood and grease from his hands. He walked back into his ruined shop, stepping over the bodies, and went straight to the corner. He picked up his cold mug of chicory substitute, wiped a speck of drywall dust off the rim, and took a sip. "Right," Dean muttered to the empty room. "Better patch that window. If you loved this grounded, gritty tale of a cynical mechanic and a runaway empress, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to help this channel grow, and subscribe for more original HFY sci-fi stories that focus on the human heart behind the heavy machinery. Have a favorite moment from Dean and Sloane's brutal escape? Drop a comment down below and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. See you in the next sector.